David Miller had always been the kind of man who moved through crowded rooms without leaving a trace. At 38, he carried himself with a quiet steadiness that his colleagues at Hartwell Financial Group often mistook for distance, and his superiors at the firm quietly appreciated for its reliability. He was a senior financial analyst, a title he had earned through 7 years of meticulous work, long nights staring at spreadsheets, and the kind of focused attention to detail that made his reports something the executive team trusted without question. He was never the loudest voice in a meeting, but he was almost always the most prepared. He did not seek recognition, and perhaps because of that, recognition had a way of finding him through the careful language of performance reviews and year-end bonuses rather than through applause or celebration. His desk on the 4th floor was always organized. His emails were always answered. His numbers were always right. And every single day, without exception, he ate lunch alone. The cafeteria at Hartwell occupied most of the 2nd floor, a wide-open space with tall windows that let the afternoon light fall across rows of long tables. By 12 o'clock, it was usually half full with clusters of colleagues who sorted themselves naturally into familiar groups: the marketing team near the coffee station, the junior analysts at the round tables by the east wall, the administrative staff nearest to the buffet line. There was a comfortable, unspoken geography to the room, and David had long since settled into his own corner of it. Every day at 12:05, he would carry his tray to the table along the north window, the one closest to the glass, where the city stretched out in the distance beyond the building's edge. He would sit facing the window. He would eat. He would sometimes open his phone and check the time or glance at a message from Ethan's school, and then he would return his tray and go back upstairs. 22 minutes, most days, sometimes 25. If the food was warm enough to slow him down, his life outside those walls followed a rhythm just as exact. He left the office at 5:15 unless a deadline made it impossible to do so, in which case he would call ahead to Mrs. Alvarez, the retired teacher who lived 2 blocks from Ethan's school, and charged him a fair rate for aftercare. He would drive to Washington Elementary by 5:45, park in the second spot from the corner because it was the closest to the front gate, and wait just inside the yard while Ethan ran toward him with his backpack bouncing and his shoelaces already half undone. They would stop at the grocery store if they needed anything, and then drive home to the small house on Clover Street, where the front porch light was always left on. David would cook while Ethan set the table, usually something simple: pasta or stir-fryer soup from a good recipe he had memorized so thoroughly he no longer needed to look it up. After dinner came dishes, then baths, then the homework that Ethan's second-grade teacher sent home in a yellow folder every Monday. After that, if time allowed, there was a chapter of whatever book they were reading together before sleep. Currently, it was a story about a boy who befriended a lighthouse keeper on a rocky New England coast, and Ethan had strong opinions about which character was the bravest. David did not think of this life as small. He thought of it as full, but there were moments, usually late at night, after Ethan was asleep and the house had gone quiet, when he would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, and feel the particular weight of silence that has no one else in it. He had loved his wife, Claire, with the kind of deep and settled love that doesn't announce itself but simply holds everything together. When she died 4 years ago from an illness that moved faster than anyone expected, the grief had been enormous and silent, and had reorganized every part of him. He had cried alone, because Ethan was 4 years old and needed a father who was steady. He had sold Claire's car, and donated her clothes, and kept only a photograph of the 3 of them, at the beach, framed above the hallway table, because Ethan sometimes stopped in front of it and asked questions that deserved honest answers. David had learned how to answer them. He had learned how to be enough. And somewhere along the way, without fully deciding to, he had also learned how to stop expecting anything more for himself. He was not unhappy. He wanted to be clear about that, in the quiet, interior way that a man is clear about things he never says aloud. He was not unhappy. He had a son who was bright and funny, and left crayon drawings on the refrigerator. He had work that mattered, and a house that was his, and mornings when the light came through the kitchen window, and Ethan sat at the table eating cereal and talking about dragons as if they were a perfectly reasonable topic for 7:30 in the morning. David would sit across from him with his coffee and think, "This is enough. This is everything." And he believed it completely. He just sometimes wished, in those quiet late hours, that he did not have to believe it quite so hard. Olivia Carter arrived at Hartwell Financial Group on a Tuesday in mid-September, transferred from the Chicago branch, with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her presence known before anyone had quite figured out where to place her. She was 32 years old, and she had the kind of composure that people who have not yet been tested tend to confuse with coldness. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a way that was practical rather than severe, and she spoke in meetings with a precision that impressed the senior partners and unsettled some of the junior staff who had grown accustomed to being the sharpest people in the room. She did not participate in the informal group chat. She did not attend the optional Thursday afternoon happy hour in the break room. She was not rude about any of this if someone spoke to her. She responded with genuine attention, but she did not go out of her way to make herself socially legible to people who had not yet earned her trust. The general consensus, formed within her first week, was that she was difficult. The word went around the way it always does in office environments, attached to women who do not perform warmth on request. A few of the longer-tenured staff tried to include her in lunch invitations and received polite but firm declines. The administrative coordinator, a cheerful woman named Brenda, who prided herself on knowing everyone's birthday and coffee order, told anyone who would listen that Olivia was pleasant enough, but simply not a people person. Olivia overheard this once and said nothing, which most people interpreted as confirmation, and which was actually the most efficient way she knew to spend her energy on a Tuesday afternoon. On her first day in the cafeteria, she carried her tray through the serving line with the calm of someone who had done this in many different rooms and many different buildings, and found the experience largely interchangeable. She looked at the room, the clusters of familiar faces, the groups already arranged in their comfortable patterns, the two long empty tables near the back wall, where no one sat, because the light from the overhead fixtures was slightly harsher there. She walked the length of the room, and then she set her tray down at the table along the north window, in the chair directly across from a man with dark circles under his eyes who was eating chicken and rice and looking at nothing in particular, and she said, quietly and without preamble, "Hi." David looked up. He was not used to company at this table. For a moment he simply looked at her, working through the brief and reasonable surprise of finding another person sitting across from him in a space that had been uncontested for years. He nodded. "Hi," he said back, and then, because he was a man who respected other people's silence, he returned to his food and let her return to hers, and the two of them ate in quiet that was, without either of them formally deciding so, completely comfortable. The next day, Olivia came again. She walked the same path through the cafeteria, past the same clusters of colleagues engaged in their familiar routines, and set her tray down at the same table in the same chair, as if there had never been any other option to consider. David noticed this with a quietness that was itself a kind of response. He did not say anything about it. He nodded again, and she nodded back, and they ate in the same comfortable quiet as before, the city laid out in the light beyond the glass, neither of them in any particular hurry to arrive somewhere else. He found himself thinking, with mild and passing curiosity, that perhaps she simply liked the window. He liked the window too. It seemed like a reasonable explanation. He filed it away and did not think about it further. By the end of the first week, he had begun to find her presence unremarkable in the way that familiar things become unremarkable. Not invisible, exactly, but simply expected. She was there at 12:05, or close to it. She sat across from him. She ate without looking at her phone, which was something he noticed because almost everyone in the cafeteria was looking at a phone. Sometimes she brought a small notebook and wrote in it in handwriting he could not read from across the table. On Wednesday she asked him if the soup was good, and he said it was decent. On Friday she said the fish was overcooked, and he agreed. These were not conversations so much as small acknowledgments that they were both present and paying reasonable attention to the world around them, and David found them entirely tolerable, which in his current vocabulary was a fairly high compliment. What surprised him was the question she asked at the end of the second week. Quietly, while she was already gathering her things to leave, she said, "How's Ethan?" David looked up from his tray. He had not told her Ethan's name. He was fairly certain he had not mentioned his son at all in their brief, practical exchanges. He said, "You know his name?" And she said, without any particular emphasis, "You had a video call one day, last week." He was talking about a lighthouse. David remembered that call. He had stepped away from his desk and taken it in the break room, which shared a wall with the cafeteria entrance. Ethan had been excited about a chapter in their book and had called during lunch to tell him how he thought it should end. David had laughed, and it had felt good to laugh. He had not thought anyone was paying attention. "He's good," David said, finally. "He's doing really well." Olivia smiled, not broadly, but in a way that reached her eyes, and then she left, and David sat for a moment longer at his table by the window, looking at the city outside, feeling something he couldn't quite name settle gently somewhere in his chest. The weeks that followed had a quality of accumulation, small things building on small things in the way that rivers are built by rain. David had always been the kind of person who noticed details in spreadsheets, in financial models, in the subtle patterns of numbers that most analysts skimmed past. He brought that same attention, without meaning to the presence of Olivia Carter across his lunch table. He noticed that she always arrived at almost exactly the same time, never more than 3 minutes past 12, as if she had calculated the optimal moment to get through the serving line before it slowed. He noticed that she always chose a soup or something warm, even on mild days, and that she drank her coffee without sugar. He noticed that she never looked uncomfortable in silence, not fidgety or searching for something to say, but genuinely at ease with the absence of conversation in a way that most people, in David's experience, were not. He also noticed things about her at work, which he was in a position to see because their desks were on the same floor and her projects occasionally overlapped with his in the quarterly review cycle. She was thorough. She was fast. She gave credit to other people's contributions in a way that was so natural and specific that it was clearly a habit rather than a performance. Once, in a team meeting, a junior analyst named Kevin had quietly corrected a figure in one of Olivia's preliminary reports. A small error. The kind that gets caught in the first review, and she had thanked him directly, by name, in front of the group, in a way that made him sit a little taller for the rest of the afternoon. David had watched that and felt something like recognition. It was the kind of thing he would have done. Meanwhile, David's own habits at the office were something Olivia had been watching for weeks, with the quiet, careful attention of someone who has learned that the most important things about a person are rarely the things they announce. She had noticed early on that David always left at 5:15, or as close to it as his workload allowed, and that he never apologized for this the way some people in demanding jobs felt obligated to do instead. He simply organized his work so that the most critical pieces were finished before that hour, and if something ran over, he would come in early the next morning rather than stay late that night. She had noticed that he kept a photograph on his desk that she could not quite see from her angle, but that he glanced at sometimes, briefly, the way you glance at something that anchors you. She had noticed the video calls taken quietly in corridors, the laughter that escaped from them occasionally before he caught himself, the way he came back to his desk afterward, with a slightly different posture, not happier exactly, but fuller. She had noticed the way he brought his own lunch on Tuesdays and Thursdays in a reusable container, and that on those days the food inside looked homemade. Once she had caught a glimpse of a container of what appeared to be pasta salad with cherry tomatoes, and another time something wrapped in foil that smelled like it had been seasoned with garlic and herbs. She noticed that he helped people without drawing attention to it, covering for a colleague who had a family emergency without mentioning it at the status meeting. Walking a new hire through the reporting system on a Friday afternoon when his own deadline was close. The other staff thought David was pleasant but unremarkable. A reliable workhorse who did his job and went home. Olivia thought something different. She thought he was doing something genuinely difficult every single day, without complaint and without audience, and that the only person who fully understood the weight of what he was carrying was him. She found this, quietly and without romanticism, the most admirable thing she had seen in a long time. The day that changed everything happened on a Wednesday in October, when the woman who usually watched Ethan after school called at 9 in the morning with a stomach virus that had arrived suddenly and completely ruled out the possibility of caring for an 8-year-old. David had no backup for situations like this. He had a short list of people he could call, but Mrs. Alvarez was his first option, and his second option was unavailable that week, and his third option was his colleague James, who had his own 3-year-old and a wife who traveled for work. He spent 40 minutes on the phone and came up with no solution. By 9:50, with the school day starting in 10 minutes and a 10:30 meeting he genuinely could not reschedule, he made the only decision available. He called the school, explained the situation, asked if they could keep Ethan until 11, and drove to pick up his son directly after the meeting ended. Ethan arrived at the Hartwell offices at 11:30, wearing his blue backpack and his most serious expression, which he always wore in situations where he was trying to demonstrate that he understood the gravity of the circumstances. He had his drawing pad and a handful of crayons and a book about marine animals in a juice box, and he sat very carefully in the small chair beside David's desk and did not touch anything. He was not supposed to touch, and spoke in a voice that was one full register quieter than his normal voice, which was still, by most measures, quite loud. The other analysts on the floor glanced over occasionally with the mixed expression of people who find children charming in theory and mildly stressful in proximity to their work, and Ethan ignored them with the focused dignity of a child who knows he is being observed and is trying very hard to be impressive. It was Olivia who stopped first. She was walking back from the printer with a set of collated reports, and she slowed as she passed David's desk, looked down at the drawing. Ethan was working on a large green shape with too many teeth, and what appeared to be a volcano in the background, and said, without condescension, with the direct and uncomplicated curiosity of someone who is genuinely asking, "Is that a T-Rex, or a different kind of dinosaur?" Ethan looked up at her. He considered the question with visible seriousness. "It's a Spinosaurus," he said. "It's bigger than a T-Rex, and it eats fish." Olivia nodded as if this were exactly the information she had been looking for. "That's impressive," she said. "I didn't know they ate fish." "Most people don't," Ethan confirmed, with the patient generosity of an expert speaking to an interested beginner. Olivia smiled, and David, who had been pretending to look at his monitor while actually watching the entire exchange, saw it. The real smile, the one that started slowly and reached her eyes completely, the one that had nothing performing in it at all. For the rest of the afternoon, Ethan drew and read and ate a granola bar that David had packed in the front pocket of the blue backpack. And once or twice, Olivia passed the desk again and made a brief, easy comment, once about a new drawing he was working on, once asking if he liked the marine animal book. Ethan answered both times with the full seriousness he brought to conversations he considered important, and by 4 o'clock he had, in his particular and self-contained way, decided that Olivia was a good person. Children are better at this than adults give them credit for. They read something in the texture of an interaction that has nothing to do with what is said. At 5:15, when David was packing up, Olivia appeared at his desk with a small box, a set of artist-grade colored pencils, the good kind, with a sharpener built into the lid. She held them out to Ethan and said, simply, "For the Spinosaurus." Ethan's face lit up with the full and uncomplicated brightness of a child, receiving exactly what he wanted without having to ask for it. He looked at his father. David said, "What do you say?" And Ethan said, "Thank you very much," in the register he reserved for extremely important moments, which was, again, still quite loud. David looked at Olivia over his son's head. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She said, "I know," and picked up her own bag and said goodnight to Ethan and walked to the elevator without ceremony. And David stood there for a moment, with his son holding a box of colored pencils, and felt something in the vicinity of his chest that he did not yet have language for. There is a kind of loneliness that does not feel like loneliness while you are inside it, because you are too busy to feel it. You have things to do and places to be, and a child who needs dinner and a work project that is due by Friday, and a grocery list somewhere on your phone and a dentist appointment you have been rescheduling for 3 months. You are not sitting in an empty room staring at the walls. You are moving, constantly, from one necessary thing to the next, and the movement itself is enough to fill the space that sadness might otherwise occupy. It is only when something outside the routine reaches toward you unexpectedly, a question asked with real interest, a smile given without calculation, a box of colored pencils handed to a small boy who likes dinosaurs, that you feel the shape of what has been missing. Not with grief, exactly. With something quieter. A kind of waking. David had been in motion for 4 years. He had told himself that motion was the same as living, and he had done a good enough job of believing it that he rarely stopped to examine whether it was true. He was a good father. He was a reliable employee. He was kind to his neighbors and paid his bills on time and read to his son every night before sleep. He had built a life that worked. And yet, standing at his desk at 5:15 on a Wednesday in October, with a child who was already trying to open a box of colored pencils and an elevator door closing on the back of a woman he barely knew, he felt, with unexpected and almost unwelcome clarity, that a life that works is not quite the same thing as a life that is fully inhabited. He picked up Ethan's backpack. He helped with the zipper on the pencil box. He said they would stop for ice cream on the way home because Ethan had been exceptionally well behaved, and Ethan's response to this was immediate and enthusiastic, and all at the appropriate volume. David smiled and guided his son toward the elevator, and thought about nothing in particular for the rest of the evening. But the something in his chest did not go away. It was Brenda, the administrative coordinator, who asked Olivia the question directly. She did it with the cheerful bluntness that was her particular style. On a Friday afternoon in the break room, while they were both waiting for the coffee to finish brewing. "Can I ask you something personal?" Brenda said, which in Brenda's usage was not really a question but a grammatical preamble to whatever she was going to say next. Olivia said, "You can try." Brenda said, "Why do you always sit with David at lunch? You know you could sit with us. Right? We don't bite." She said this warmly, without any particular agenda, simply curious in the way she was curious about most things. Olivia looked at the coffee machine for a moment. Then she turned to Brenda with an expression that was thoughtful rather than guarded, and said, "Do you want the real reason?" Brenda said she did. Olivia told her. On her first day in the cafeteria, before she had learned anyone's name or understood the informal geography of the room, she had been making her way through the serving line when she looked up and saw a man sitting alone at the table by the north window. He was eating quickly. The way people eat when eating is not the point of the break, but rather a task to be completed before returning to something else. He had his phone face down on the table, which struck her as unusual in a room full of people staring at their screens. And then, for no reason she could identify, he picked it up, unlocked it, and a video began playing. She could not hear it from where she was standing, but she could see the glow of it on his face, and she could see his expression change. He smiled, not politely, not for anyone's benefit, but with the private completeness of someone experiencing a moment of real joy when they think no one is watching. He watched the video for perhaps 45 seconds. Then he put the phone face down again and went back to eating, and his expression became not sad exactly, but very quiet, very still, and she recognized it. She had worn that exact expression for years, the expression of someone who has love in their life, but experiences it mostly in small pockets of time that exist between long stretches of difficult, necessary aloneness. She had picked up her tray and walked to his table and sat down, not because she had any plan or intention, but because something in her had simply said, "Not today. Not today will this person sit completely alone if I can do anything at all about it." She was not looking for a friend. She was not performing generosity. She was just someone who had spent a very long time eating lunch in rooms by herself, and knew something about what it was to be the person at the corner table, and she had enough experience with loneliness to understand that sometimes what it needs is not conversation or comfort or solution, but simply the quiet, deliberate presence of another human being who has decided that your company is worth seeking out. Brenda listened to all of this without interrupting, which was not entirely characteristic of her. When Olivia finished, Brenda said nothing for a moment, and then said, softly and without her usual brightness, "That's one of the kindest things I've ever heard." She meant it without any performance attached to it, which was its own form of tribute. Olivia shrugged, not dismissively but with the discomfort of someone unaccustomed to being seen clearly. She poured her coffee and left. Brenda stood in the break room for a long moment after she was gone, looking at the space where Olivia had been standing and feeling the particular weight that settles over you when something unexpectedly true has passed through a room and left its impression. Then she went back to her desk and did not repeat the conversation to anyone. She did, however, have no control over the fact that the break room had a door that did not close all the way, and she had no way of knowing who might be walking past it at the particular moment she had chosen to answer Brenda's question honestly, which was something she did not often do, and had done this time for reasons she had not fully examined. David had been walking past it. He had been on his way to the supply room, which shared a corridor with the break room, and the sound of his name had stopped him before he could think to keep walking. He heard most of what Olivia said to Brenda. Not all of it, he caught the last half, from the part about the video, about the smile. He stood in the corridor with his hand resting against the wall and listened to a woman describe the moment she had decided to sit down across from him at a table by a window, and he felt something happen in his chest that he did not have immediate words for. He was not a man who cried easily. He had cried the night Claire died. And he had cried once in the parking lot of the grocery store about 6 months afterward when a song came on the radio that she had loved, and those were the only 2 times he could account for in the past 4 years. But standing in the corridor outside the break room, hearing Olivia describe the way he had looked at his phone, the private smile, the stillness that came after he felt his throat tighten in the particular way it does when something true has been seen clearly by someone who did not have to look. He thought about all the days he had carried his tray to that table and assumed he was invisible. He thought about the weeks of quiet lunches, the small questions about Ethan, the Wednesday with the colored pencils. He thought about how many times he had told himself that Olivia was simply a woman who liked the window. He had been so convinced by the story he'd built around her presence, coincidence, convenience, habit, that it had not occurred to him to question whether another person might have made a deliberate choice, again and again, for the simplest and most human of reasons. Because she had seen him, and she had decided that was enough. He stood in the corridor for a long time, after the voices in the break room had faded, and he was certain both women had gone. He stood there with the supply room key in his hand, and did nothing with it. He was thinking about the video call with Ethan, and the way he had apparently looked when he thought no one could see him, the private smile that Olivia had described with such specificity that he knew she had been paying close attention, the kind of attention you only give to something you have decided matters. He was thinking about how completely he had underestimated another person's capacity for deliberate kindness, how thoroughly he had explained away her presence with the most convenient story available rather than the true one. He was a man who prided himself on reading numbers accurately, on catching the detail that others skipped, on seeing the pattern beneath the surface. He had missed this one entirely, and the missing of it felt less like embarrassment than like gratitude of the most humbling kind. Then he went to the supply room and got what he had come for, and returned to his desk and sat in front of his monitor without looking at it for nearly 5 minutes. Ethan was going to ask about his drawing again tonight, the new one with the marine animals. David had promised to help with the background. He needed to get home at 5:15. He had things to do. He always had things to do. But for just a few more minutes, he allowed himself to sit still and feel the weight of what he had heard, and the strange and unexpected tenderness of discovering that someone had been paying attention to him for weeks with no intention of getting anything from it at all. He found her the next morning before the workday fully began, at the small standing area by the 4th-floor coffee station where people tended to congregate for the first 10 minutes after 9. She was reading something on her tablet, her coffee in her other hand, and she looked up when he approached with the calm alertness that was her default mode. He said, "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I should have thanked you properly for the pencils. Ethan has already used about 12 of them, Olivia said. That's what they're for. He said. I also, and then stopped, and tried again. I was near the break room yesterday afternoon. I didn't mean to overhear. She looked at him. Her expression did not change dramatically. But something in it shifted a careful stillness, like a person bracing quietly for impact. He said, I just wanted to say thank you. For the table, for all of it. Olivia held his gaze for a moment that was slightly longer than a casual one. Then she said, you would have done the same. He thought about that. I hope so, he said. And she looked at him with that slow, complete smile, the real one, and said, I know so. And then she went back to her tablet, and he went to his desk, and the workday started in the ordinary way, except that everything inside it felt, from that morning forward, incrementally different. What came after was not dramatic. It was not the sharp, breathless story of two people suddenly discovering each other. It was quieter than that, and slower, and more honest. They began talking during lunch, rather than simply coexisting in silence, and the conversations that emerged were the kind that happen between people who have both lived through difficult things and come out with a certain appreciation for what is real. Olivia told him, over several weeks, and in the unhurried way she told everything, about her mother. About the 5 years she had spent navigating a serious illness that had consumed the shape of her life, the treatment schedules, the insurance paperwork, the way certain friendships had quietly retreated because people did not know what to say and ended up saying nothing. She had not been in a relationship during those years. She had not had the capacity. When her mother died, 2 years before she transferred to this city, she had found herself alone in an apartment that felt 3 times its actual size, with a life she needed to rebuild from a blueprint she hadn't made yet. She had come to Hartwell because the opportunity was good, and the city was different, and she had learned, through everything, that newness is not the same as healing, but it is sometimes the first condition of it. A new city means new grocery stores, new routes to work, new faces that carry none of the accumulated weight of shared history, and sometimes that blankness is exactly what a person needs in order to figure out who they are, when they are no longer defined primarily by what they are enduring. She had rented a 1-bedroom apartment with good natural light and set up a kitchen that was entirely her own for the first time in years, and she had made a practice of cooking real meals rather than assembling things from containers, which was the small and private act of care toward herself that she had decided would be her first commitment. She had not expected to find anything here other than work she was good at and a routine she could maintain with reasonable dignity. She had not expected to recognize herself in a stranger eating lunch alone by a window. But recognition, she had found, is rarely something you plan. It arrives on its own schedule, in its own form, and the only thing required of you is that you are present enough to receive it when it does. David listened to all of this with the quality of attention he gave to things that mattered. He asked questions when he had them, and was quiet when he didn't, and he did not try to compare her experience to his own, or offer the kind of abstract reassurances that people dispense when they don't know what else to give. When he told her about Claire, he did it in the same measured way he had learned to speak about her with love, and with the particular honesty of someone who has made a long peace with grief. He told her about the beach photograph, about the 4 years, about the quiet kitchen in the late evenings. He did not perform vulnerability for her. He simply offered the parts of himself that were true, and she received them with the same quiet and careful attention she gave to everything she found worth understanding. Ethan, who was 8 years old, and therefore considered himself a fair judge of character, made his assessment of Olivia Carter without being asked and communicated it to his father, in the way he communicated most important conclusions. Directly, while eating cereal, without preamble. She's good at listening, he said one morning. David said, How do you know that? And Ethan said, Because when I told her about the Spinosaurus, she didn't look at her phone. David considered this criterion for a moment. That's true, he said. She didn't. Ethan nodded with the satisfaction of a point confirmed and poured more cereal. and moved on to the subject of the marine animal book, which was now almost finished, and which he felt deserved a sequel about deep-sea creatures. David agreed that it probably did. The three of them had begun spending time together in the organic, unplanned way of people who find each other's company easy. A Saturday at the Natural History Museum. Ethan's idea, and his full-time project manager for the afternoon, steering adults from exhibit to exhibit with the focused energy of someone who has a list and intends to complete it. An evening walk along the river path that ran behind the park near David's neighborhood. Ethan running slightly ahead with the disciplined energy of a child who has been inside all day. Olivia and David walking at the pace of people who are talking about something real and are in no hurry to arrive anywhere. A Sunday afternoon in David's kitchen where Ethan had decided they were going to make chocolate chip cookies and took this responsibility seriously enough to supervise both adults simultaneously, which they submitted to without complaint. In that kitchen, with flour on the counter, and Ethan standing on the step stool that David kept near the island so he could reach things, Olivia had looked up and caught David looking at her, and they had both been very quiet for a moment, in the middle of a conversation about something entirely unrelated, cookie ratios, or whether walnuts were an acceptable addition, which Ethan was firmly against. It was the kind of moment that doesn't need to be named to be understood. And then Ethan had announced that the butter wasn't soft enough yet, and they both turned their attention back to the task at hand. And David thought, there it is. There is the thing I could not have named 6 months ago. There is the shape of what I was missing. Not love at first sight. Nothing so fast or so cinematic as that. Something slower. Something that had been building in increments too small to see individually, but which, taken together, had made something real. The house on Clover Street had always been clean and organized and well-maintained, because David was a man who understood that a good environment required consistent effort, and because Ethan had grown up knowing that you put things back where you found them. But it had also been, for 4 years, a house in which the rooms were slightly too quiet when Ethan was at school or asleep. A house where the kitchen table was set for two. A house where the evenings sometimes moved too slowly in their stillness. Things had shifted without David fully registering the shift. There were more evenings when the table was set for 3. When the TV in the living room was on because someone besides Ethan was watching it. When the house held the particular warmth of 2 adults moving through a shared space without needing to narrate every moment of it. The porch light still came on every evening at dusk, the habit of years, but the feeling behind it had changed. It was no longer simply the light of a man keeping things in order. It had become something more like an invitation. A year passed in the way that good years pass too quickly in retrospect, but with enough weight in each individual day that none of it felt wasted. In October, on a Tuesday, that was almost exactly 1 year from the day Olivia had first carried her tray to the table by the north window. Something happened that was both entirely ordinary and, for the people involved in it, completely luminous. David and Olivia arrived at the cafeteria together, a thing that had become common enough not to attract comment from anyone except Brenda, who noticed everything and had the wisdom, in this particular case, to say nothing about it out loud. They went through the serving line, and then, just behind them, and walking with the particular confidence of a child who has been here before, came Ethan, who was spending the day at the office because his school had a professional development day, and Mrs. Alvarez had a family commitment, and David had, this time, someone to call. Ethan carried his own tray with the gravity of a person participating in an important process. He had ordered the pasta, which he had declared to be the best option after consulting both adults for their opinions, and dismissing David's suggestion of the soup with the authority of a child who has strong feelings about broth. He walked with them to the table by the north window. He set his tray down. He pulled out his chair and climbed into it, and arranged his fork and knife in a way that satisfied his sense of order. And then he looked out the window at the city beyond the glass, and said, in the observational tone he often used for things he found interesting, "You can see really far from here." David sat down. Olivia sat down. 3 trays on a table that had, for years, held one. Colleagues passing through the cafeteria glanced at them with the comfortable familiarity of people who had watched something take shape slowly enough to feel inevitable. Brenda, from across the room, allowed herself one small private smile before returning her attention to her salad. David looked at Olivia across the table. She was cutting her food with the same neat, unhurried movements he had watched for a year, and she looked up when she felt his gaze and met it with the ease of someone who had grown accustomed to being looked at by this particular person, without needing to prepare for it. He said, quietly, so that only she could hear under the ambient noise of the room. "Thank you," she said. For what? In the way she sometimes said things she already knew the answer to but wanted to hear him say aloud. He said, "For that first day. For carrying your tray over here when you didn't have to." She considered this for a moment. "I had to," she said. "Not had to like someone made me. Had to like I couldn't have done anything else." He understood the distinction. He was quiet for a moment. "If you hadn't," he said, "I think I would have kept eating alone and told myself it was fine." Olivia set down her fork. She looked at him with the full, level attention she gave to things she wanted to say carefully. "You were fine," she said. "You were doing everything right. I just wanted you to know that you didn't have to be alone while you did it." He looked at her. He thought about Claire, and the photograph, and the 4 years, and the late evenings in the kitchen. He thought about everything he had built in the space of not expecting anything more. And how unexpectedly, quietly, without disruption, something more had arrived and made itself at home. "I know that now," he said. Ethan, who had been engaged with his pasta and had not appeared to be listening to any of this, chose this moment to look up from his chair, which broke the moment cleanly and completely. And both David and Olivia laughed the kind of laughter that comes out full and unguarded when something has been quietly holding you and then releases you all at once. Ethan looked at them with the patient exasperation of a child, surrounded by adults who are occasionally difficult to follow. "What?" he said. David said they could absolutely get dessert. Olivia said she wanted to see what the options were. Ethan slid out of his chair with the purpose of a person who has made a decision and is committed to executing it. The table by the north window sat empty for a moment, while all 3 of them stood in line at the dessert station. Ethan explaining to Olivia in careful detail why the chocolate option was clearly superior to the fruit option. She listened with the attention she always gave him, which was the full and complete kind, without the small adjustments people make when they are being patient rather than interested. Outside, the city went on in its ordinary October way, the light falling at the particular angle of mid-autumn that makes even familiar skylines look briefly magnificent. The table waited. It would always wait. It had become, without anyone formally declaring it, the kind of place that has a specific gravity, the place where 3 people who found each other by accident and chose each other on purpose had learned that a life is not a fixed thing, that it can be added to, that the space beside you at any given table is not necessarily empty just because no one has claimed it yet. There are decisions that change the course of a life that look, from the outside, like nothing at all. A tray carried across a room. A chair pulled out. A word offered into a silence that could just as easily have been left intact. From the outside, they are invisible. They make no sound. Nobody marks the moment they occur. But the person who needed them feels them land with the particular weight of something that has traveled a great distance to arrive. And sometimes, years later, when the thing that grew from them has become so natural you cannot imagine the world without it. You look back at the ordinary Tuesday when it all began, the fluorescent light, the noise of the cafeteria, the window looking out at the city, and you understand that the most important threshold you ever crossed was the width of a lunch table, that the distance between a life of necessary aloneness and a life that is fully inhabited was measured not in miles or years or grand gestures, but in the quiet, deliberate number of steps it takes to carry a tray across a room and sit down next to someone who needed, more than anything, simply not to be alone. David Miller had always known how to take care of things. He had always known how to be enough. What he had not known, until a woman in a gray blazer set her tray across from his, and said hi with the simplicity of someone who has decided that a thing worth doing is worth doing without preamble, was that being enough for everyone else does not require being alone. That choosing the right table is sometimes all it takes, that some things do not announce themselves when they begin, and it is only later at a table by a window, with 3 trays and October light, and a child asking about chocolate dessert, that you look around and recognize what you have, and feel the whole beautiful improbability of it, and are grateful.